Hi FCC, my name is Bonnie Worthen and I am the Children's Director here. We have so missed having your kids around here and I cannot wait until we can hang together. One of the things my team is doing to make that connection now is something we call Kid Church. It is a on-demand program, about 45 minutes every weekend for your children. Now, today, of course, we're having a little bit of a technicality, some sound issues, but it's going to be up hopefully in the next hour for your kids. And I'm so super excited because we added 2 new segments. So your kids are going to love it. You can check that out on our Facebook group at FCC HB Family or on our YouTube channel, which is FCC HB Next Gen. Now, if you haven't already done it, First Steps is a great 4 series. They're really short videos to help you know a little bit more about FCC and also about yourself. There is, okay, spoiler alert, if you want to plug your ears, there is a personality test at the end. That is actually a lot of fun to do. All you need to do is go to fcchb.com/First Steps to check that out. Another thing that's happening this week on Tuesday at 7:30, we are having a worship night. I'm really excited about doing this. We're going to have a time when we get to come together, we get to sing songs, we get to pray, and just hang out as a family. So make sure you join us at fcchb.com/live. So that's Tuesday night at 7 p.m., okay? If you are new or newer with us, we haven't actually probably met you in person, so we can't wait to do that. But for now, we would love to get to know you. So if you go to fcchb.com/connect card, there's a small form we would love for you to fill out. Help us to get to know you a little bit more. And as a way to say thank you, we'll send you a digital gift. I still haven't figured out what the digital gift is. So if someone knows, let me know, okay? I'm dying to know. So thank you again for joining us, FCC, and the service starts now.
So Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. And worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. And worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy, worthy. Oh, this is amazing grace. This is amazing love. That you would take my place. That you would bear my cross. You laid down your life. That I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. All that you've done for me.
Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, for hanging out with us. Thank you for inviting us into your home to spend this time singing together and just kind of talking about life and faith. Hope you are doing well. We're excited. This week, we're starting a brand new series called The Good Life. We're really looking forward to that. But first, as we begin, I want to take a minute to introduce you to my friend here. And you're looking at him, you may think, hey, he looks kind of familiar, because over the last 6 months or so, he's spoken here, I think 2 different times, like once right after, like right around the first of the year and right when we started the whole quarantine thing. But this is Stephen Pate. And the reason I'm introducing to you Stephen Pate now is I'm excited to let you know that Stephen this week joined our staff. He's our newest staff member. He is our Director of Digital Engagement. And so what that means is we recognize during the season that there has been this massive shift in just how people digitally engage with churches. And it's been happening even before COVID. But really, as a result of COVID, it's changed a lot. And it's not just people watching services online. It's also how people engage and how people interact. And so what we want to be real intentional about going forward is how do we use our digital strategies to really create disciples? Disciples is the word the New Testament uses for followers of Jesus. And so how do we help people become followers of Jesus and disciples of Jesus, not just physically, but physically and online, and how do we blend those? And so Stephen's going to help oversee that. You're also going to see him, though, fairly frequently. He'll be a regular part of our teaching team, so you'll see him here on weekends and hosting and doing a bunch of other things. So everybody, Stephen, everybody.
Hey.
And we thought it'd be fun to get to know Stephen a little bit. And so I have some questions that I'm going to ask him in just a second. But before I ask him those specific questions, Stephen, I wonder if you wouldn't just mind sharing everybody just a couple things about you and your life.
Sure, absolutely. Well, FCC, I'm just unbelievably excited to be a part of this church family and this community. So excited to be here. A couple things about me. I'm married. My wife's name is Marissa. I'm sure you'll meet her soon. Originally, I'm from Southern California, born here, but actually grew up in Portland, Oregon, so in the Pacific Northwest. But then I came to my senses and moved back down here to Southern California. I went to school at Hope International University. That's my alma mater. Another thing you might not know is that Scott and I used to do winter camps together back in the day. So I've known him for a few years, and we've had some fun in our youth ministry days together.
Yeah. And see, that's all good stuff. That's all good stuff to know, and you'll get to know a lot more about Stephen and Marissa, especially as we start to get back together physically and you meet them. But the way you really get to know someone is you ask them like the really tough questions, which is what I have here. I have a series of questions that some of our staff has put together. These are ones that really force you to like search your soul, and this is where you truly get to know the depth of a person. Now, Stephen does not know what these questions are. These, even last service, we had a whole different set of questions. We've intentionally kept these because we want his reactions to be raw and authentic and real so we can really get to know him. And for those of you watching at home, I want you to also answer these questions there. If you're sitting around with your family or with your spouse or friends or whatever, I want you to really struggle with these because these are some meaningful, powerful questions. So ready? Here we go. The first one. True or false? They're all true or false questions, by the way, so that makes it easier. True or false? There is a correct way to load the dishwasher. This is a tough one. I know I can sense some arguments happening with some families, some spouses in there. So Stephen, true or false?
I would say true, although admittedly, I don't know if I know what that correct way is. Just being honest. I feel like I never do it the right way.
You never do it the right way?
I don't think
Top
so.
first from the back. See, like on the bottom shelf, I always load from the back first.
Okay.
Always.
Maybe that's the
Because then
trick.
you got to reach back. That's just me. I don't know if
That's
that's
my
right or wrong.
wife, if I know how to load the dishwasher correctly.
Number 2, true or false. Now, another thing, I did not write any of these questions, just for what it's worth. So it's going to seem like I did, but I did not. Number 2, the Green Bay Packers are the greatest football team ever. True or false? Your employment's not on the line here. You're totally good.
I mean, this is a tough question. I mean, know your audience, right? True, correct, yes,
That
they
is
are.
absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And if those of you who disagree, you can be wrong. This is a place of grace, and we still love you, but that is absolutely true. Number 3, true or false? You floss your teeth every day. Now, before you answer, let me just go ahead and say, when we say every day, again, I don't know who wrote this question, but this is how we're going to define it. I understand that sometimes maybe you run out of floss and you didn't buy it, or maybe sometimes you're just tired and you forget. So I'm not like, it's not a legalistic definition, but as a general routine, you floss your teeth every day, true or false?
Yeah, true.
True?
I try to.
Once or twice?
Once.
Okay.
Yeah. Once a day.
Before bed is when I
Same.
floss mine.
Yeah.
All right. Number 4, true or false? Americans drive on the wrong side of the road. This is
False.
false. You think it's false?
False, yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Well, we'll see. Number 5, true or false? Crying is how eyes sweat. Crying is how eyes sweat. True or false?
True, sure. Crying is how I sweat.
That's a deep question right
Yeah,
there.
I guess
That's,
so. Yeah.
I've heard people say that. I have never said that. I have never used that as an excuse. My eyes are sweating.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of a crier. Like, you can ask my wife or my children.
Yeah.
That, like in every Pixar movie, when there's like those really depressing moments, they'll look at me and make fun of me because I'm the one of the
Your
four
eyes
that's
are
crying.
sweating.
Yeah, my eyes are sweating. Here we go. The last one. Number 6. Again, I did not write this question. Number 6. True or false? The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which again goes back to the story in the book of Genesis. Genesis 1, God creates everything and it's great, but then, the first people, Adam and Eve, they eat from this tree of knowledge of good and evil. They eat this fruit. The fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil was an avocado. So, essentially, is avocado the thing that sin entered our world through?
Wow. I mean, I love avocados, so maybe I would say it was very tempting because they're so delicious. Maybe I'll go with that direction. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Just to let you know too, they put that in there really for me because I hate avocado.
hate avocado.
Like
Okay.
taste and texture.
Huh.
I can eat just about anything. Like I'm good with it, but like that literally makes
I'll
me
pray
gag.
for you.
Yeah. That's pretty much what most people say because most people love avocado. So I always say as a joke that I believe that avocado. I'm going to write a doctoral dissertation on how avocado was a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it brought sin into the world. So, well, there you go. See, now we're really getting to know the true depths of Stephen by answering these questions. So, Stephen, thank you so much. And again, you'll see Stephen around a lot more. Eventually, you'll get to meet his wife, Marissa. Great, incredible people. I'm so excited for them to be a part of our team, for you to just get to know them, and for everything he's going to bring to us. So, again, this week we're starting a brand new series called The Good Life. We're going to talk about how do we live the good life. But before we do that, we're going to sing another song together. So I'm going to throw it right back to the band, and won't you join us as we sing.
You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies till all my fears are gone. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Your blood flows through my veins, and I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God, and I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. Lord, we praise you. We thank you that each of us in our different ways are all your children, Lord. We thank you so much that we can rest in that truth. We thank you for your goodness, and I pray that you would just open our hearts and our ears and our minds to what you have to share with us this morning, Lord. We praise you. Thank you for your love and your grace. In your name we pray. Amen.
Division is nothing new in our country and our culture. It's been around for a long time. And the reason that it's still here and the reason that it's still festering and growing is because we've never been able to overcome it. We've never been able to find a way to overcome it and to move through it into more kind of unity. But I believe with all my heart that there is a way forward. I believe there is a way forward that brings people together and that unites people. What I want to do, if I can, is to the best of my ability, I want to describe to you, I want to try to paint a picture for you of what it was like to be a Jew living in first century Israel under Roman rule. Now, the Jewish people had a long, rich history and tradition in their homeland, what you and I know as Israel and the Palestinian territories. That their tradition went back years and years and years, and they had these great stories about their ancestors, people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Ruth and Esther and David, and all of these heroic stories, and they had this rich tradition and this rich past. But by the time you get to the first century, even though you have Jews who are still living in their ancestral homeland, all of that greatness, all of that glory is really nothing but a distant memory. It's stories they used to tell because the reality they're experiencing in the first century world is one of oppression. That they are ruled by Rome. And Rome is really the story of the rise of Rome is interesting because if you look historically, Rome kind of slowly begins to rise to power. But when you get to the time just before the first century, there's this period of just brutal civil war and there's violence and there's bloodshed. But out of that emerges Octavius, who becomes Caesar Augustus, who reorganizes Rome into an empire. And that's when they really kind of start to take control of the Mediterranean world. And so while the reality is Rome's rise to power was kind of slow, for like first century people living in Israel, first century Jews, and a lot of people living in the Mediterranean world, their rise to power seemed to be pretty sudden. That when Caesar came on and when they became this empire, that seemed to happen pretty quick. And now they are ruling a lot of the Mediterranean world, including the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. Now, when Rome becomes an empire and when they take control, really for the Roman people, for the Roman citizens, this is a great thing. It's a celebration because they're moving out of this period of violence and bloodshed and civil war, and they're moving into this time of peace and prosperity, and the economy's booming, and everything's going really well. It institutes what's known as Pax Romana, which is the season of peace and prosperity within the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire's rule, if you are a Roman citizen, if you are an insider, is a really great thing. It's a celebrated thing. But if you are a Jewish person living in first century Israel, you are not a part of the Roman system. You are an outsider. And so it's not such a great thing because all Rome's laws, all Rome's rules, all Rome's customs and rituals were designed to reinforce the Roman way and really to kind of force you to conform to the Roman life. But as a first century Jew, you didn't want to conform to the Roman life. You were proud of your heritage and your ancestors and your people and where you came from. And so what you wanted is you wanted back what you had lost. You wanted back what you hear about in these stories. You wanted back this rich tradition and history, but you didn't have it because you were under Roman rule and under Roman oppression. And even though Rome is a long ways away from Israel, Rome had appointed local leadership that was always looking over your back to make sure that you were doing and saying the right things. And if you ever got out of line, they would respond ruthlessly and brutally. And so what you have in first century Israel is you have all these Jewish people with this growing tension of frustration with the dominant culture around them. Because they're in a lot of ways, again, being forced to kind of conform to this Roman life. And so you have all these Jewish people that are trying to figure out, how do we not conform? How do we hold strong? Some people wanted to do that through observance of the law, the Jewish law. Let's follow the law because the law is what makes us distinct from Romans and we don't want to be like them. But you did have several other Jewish people who wanted to rise up and revolt. And during this period of time, you have several charismatic Jewish figures that would rise up and say, hey, we can overthrow Rome, we can defeat Rome. And they would lead these little revolts, they would lead these little uprisings. In some cases, they would have some victories. And they would maybe claim some land, and they would sometimes get large followings of people. But all of those ultimately ended in just more bloodshed. And so what happens is in first century Jews who are living in Israel, you begin to have this growing despair that the further and further we get away from our past, the less likely we are to ever get back to something that looks like that. That it's just kind of this distant memory, and as hard as we try, we can never get back there, and so the further and further we keep moving, it's never going to be like what it was. And you begin to get this kind of sense of despair. Now, the reality that first century Jews in Israel faced is not unique to them. That really, sadly, has been a common experience for different people groups all over the planet and still is in a lot of ways today. But as common as that reality is, there was something very unique that happened in first century Israel. In first century Israel, there was a man who claimed that he had come to actually do away with that. And more than just like came to do away with it, there was a man who actually said that God sent me here to deal with this. God actually sent me here in order to provide a brand new way forward. And this man, what's interesting is when he's about 30 years old, he's in his hometown in Capernaum, and he goes into the synagogue, which a synagogue is like a local church. And he stands up in front of this church in his hometown, and he takes out a scroll from the book of Isaiah, which is one of the books that we have in our Old Testament, which in the first century world was the Bible that the Jewish people had. So he takes out the scroll of the book of Isaiah, and he reads this passage. It's a really famous passage. Jewish people in the first century would have been very familiar with it. But when Jesus reads this particular passage, he doesn't read it as the words of Isaiah. Jesus reads it about himself. And he says, what Isaiah is saying here is about me. And here's what he reads. He reads a section that says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so Jesus reads this really famous passage and he says, here's the thing. This is all about me. God's Spirit is another way of saying presence. Jesus says, God's presence is on me. And here's what he sent me to do. Proclaim good news. I have good news. That God is going to bring freedom and recovery, and he's going to set oppressed people free, and God's favor is with us. This is the announcement that Jesus makes. And he says, what he tells his hometown is that God is going to accomplish all of this through me. This is why I'm here. My presence here is good news. But his hometown is having none of it. Here's how they respond. They got up drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. Now, just so you know, personally, for me, these are the most encouraging words in the entire Bible. And you might look at that and go, how are these encouraging words? Let me explain. I've been teaching in church context for many years. I did it a lot of years when I was in a youth minister. I've been doing it now for about 7 years as a lead pastor. And over that time, there's been some messages I've taught that I've thought, wow, that was really pretty good. And there's other messages I've thought, Scott, that was total garbage. Sometimes I've walked away and thought, why did I even say that? Do I even believe that? And over the years, there have been a lot of people that have been really encouraging. There's also been instances where people have come up and they've challenged me on things. They've disagreed on things. And sometimes people have pointed out, hey, you were wrong on this, or you quoted that wrong, or you said this wrong, or don't forget about this. And those are always very humbling, but at the same time, they're necessary. I mean, if I say something wrong, by all means, correct it, point it out. I'm human, I make mistakes. But in all of my experiences, as much as people may have disagreed with me, as much as I may have done things wrong, there has never been a point in my life where one person, let alone a group of people, were so upset at what I had to say that they tried to kill me. And so I always take comfort in this because as bad as it might have been, it still wasn't this bad. So I'm still doing better than Jesus. But this is how the crowd responds to him. And remember, this is his hometown. This is how they responded. And what's interesting, now, just for the record, they don't actually kill him here. He kind of gets away and goes and keeps doing his thing. But the question you have to ask is, why do they respond to him this way? What is it specifically about Jesus that forces people right from the very beginning to respond to him? Sometimes I think we get the misconception when you read through the life of Jesus that he's just surrounded by people who love him and support him. And especially when you read through Mark, which there's 4 books that we call Gospels, 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Specifically in the book of Mark, there's always these crowds around Jesus. There's always people gathering around to see what he's going to do or what he's going to say. People are fascinated by him. And that is true. There's a lot of crowds that go over with Jesus. But sometimes I think we get the idea that these crowds are all a part of his movement, that he has this huge, massive movement. But if you look at people that are actually committed to him, the word the New Testament uses to talk about followers of Jesus is the word disciples. If you look at how many people, they're not just there to see, but they've made a commitment, they're part of his movement, they're willing to do whatever he says. After Jesus' resurrection, we're told that there's really only 120 followers of Jesus. There's only 120 disciples. So even though there may be crowds of people that gather around to see what Jesus is going to do, in terms of an actual committed core of his movement, it's not that big. And the question you have to ask is why? Because again, this whole Jesus, his movement, that's all happening in the midst of this period of time where Jewish people have this growing frustration. They want to rise up. They want to overthrow Rome. And at times, they're willing to follow these charismatic figures, a lot of times to their death. And sometimes these charismatic figures, they'll recruit large groups of people that will literally march with them to their death to try to overthrow Rome. So what is it about Jesus? Why is it that from the very beginning, people are already upset at Jesus, that they're already willing to dismiss Jesus, that they're not willing to follow? What is it specifically about him that right from the beginning, a lot of people just reject and say, no, I don't want anything to do with you? What's fascinating is if you go back to what we talked about in the beginning, the reality between Rome and Israel. The fascinating thing is when you look at the Roman Empire and the Roman people and that structure, and when you look at Jewish people who were living in first century Israel, the reality is both of those groups want the exact same thing. They're both after the same thing. And what they want is they want the good life. I mean, that's what they're after. Romans really want the good life for them, for their families, for their children, for their grandchildren, for their friends, for their neighbors. That's what they want. And in fact, again, when you talk about Pax Romana, when the empire kind of emerges, Pax Romana is celebrated by the Roman people because it brings about peace, it brings about prosperity, it brings about economic boom and gain. Pax Romana is the way for Roman people and for people within the Roman system to experience the good life. Because Pax Romana puts an end to generals killing other generals and senators killing generals and violence and bloodshed and uncertainty. The emergence of the empire brings about peace and prosperity to people within the empire. And so what Rome wants to do is Rome wants to hold on to the status quo because the status quo is the means by which Romans live the good life. Now, on the other extreme, you have Jews living in Israel. And what they want for themselves and for their families and their children and their grandchildren and their neighbors is they want the good life. But whereas the Roman system gives Romans the good life, it actually ends up denying Jews the good life. Because again, the Roman system is about preserving the Roman way of life and that culture, and doesn't allow the same kind of freedom and equality to groups like first century Jews. And so this is why you have Jews. The only way we can experience the good life is we have to overthrow Rome. We have to get rid of Rome. We have to get them out of here. And what's fascinating is even a lot of Jesus' closest followers, Jesus inner circles this group called the 12, sometimes we call them the apostles. A lot of the apostles were convinced that this is ultimately where Jesus was going. That ultimately he was going to lead this revolt, and he was going to fight against Rome, and he was going to march into the emperor's palace and get rid of the emperor and reestablish freedom. So much so that Matthew, in his account of the life of Jesus, when he talks about Jesus' arrest, when Jesus is arrested and then right before he's put on trial, condemned, and then killed, Matthew says, here's what happens when Jesus is arrested. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So at Jesus' arrest, his closest followers were like, no, now's the time, let's fight. Takes off a sword and cuts off a guy's ear. But here's how Jesus responds. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And then Jesus kind of like willingly goes off with the people that came there to arrest him. So even though, like this point now at the very end, Jesus' followers are like, okay, we're ready. Now's the time. Now we're going to fight. Now we're going to overthrow him. Jesus stops and says, no, that's not what we're going to do. See, ultimately the reason that Jesus is rejected by first century Jews is because they didn't believe that he could give them the good life that they wanted. What's fascinating is that not only did Jews not believe that Jesus could give them the good life, but if you look on the other side, Romans, or within the first century Jewish mindset, they would refer to anyone who's not a Jew as a Gentile. Gentiles didn't like Jesus either because they didn't believe he could give them a good life. That ultimately the reason Jesus is rejected, and it's not like Jesus is rejected by this side and accepted by this side. Ultimately, Jesus is rejected by everybody. And the reason he's rejected by everybody is because nobody believes that Jesus can actually give them the good life they want. Because for the Jewish people on one side, Jesus is not leading this revolt to, overthrow Rome. But on the other side, for Romans, for Gentiles, Jesus is a threat to the status quo. And when you're a threat to the status quo, then you're a threat to my power and to my status and to my wealth and to my good life. When you look at the actual death of Jesus, here's what's interesting. People have always debated, that you can even find like scholarly debates, who's actually responsible for the death of Jesus. And what's interesting is at the death of Jesus, it's actually both Jews and Romans that come together. That Jesus is first arrested by the Jewish leadership who puts him on trial and condemns him. Then they hand him over to the Romans who actually crucify him. So it's actually both sides. Both sides come together to kill Jesus, to get rid of Jesus. Because neither one of them believes that Jesus can give them a good life. Because on one hand, you're not doing what we want you to do. And on the other hand, you're a threat to what's already here. So we may not get along with each other, we may not like each other, but what we both can agree on is that this is not the guy and we need to get rid of him. And so both sides are willing to come together to get rid of Jesus. Because he's not doing what we want and he's a threat to the way things are, and so neither side believes that Jesus can give him the good life. Because here's what Jesus does. In the midst of all of this, and people are trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we press forward? Jesus does something that is brand new. Jesus does something that is revolutionary. Jesus does something that defies all logic and reason. Jesus does something that no one expects. Here's how one of his followers wrote it. Peter, one of the 12 apostles. Here's what Peter says. It says, here's what Jesus did in the midst of all of this mess. That he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds, you have been healed. See, here's what Jesus understood. Jesus understood that when it comes to pain and when it comes to sin, that stuff has to be dealt with. See, sometimes we just act like, well, why can't it just disappear? Why can't it just vanish? Whatever, all the things that I've done wrong, why can't that just go away? All the pain that someone may have felt, why can't that just go away? And the truth is because it can't. It just doesn't. Pain just doesn't evaporate. It just doesn't dissolve. At some point, it has to be dealt with. And this is what people in the first century, how do we deal with it? What do we do with all this anger? What do we do with all this pain? What do we do with all this selfishness? What do we do with all this oppression? And so Jesus comes along, and here's what Jesus does. Peter says, here's what he does. He literally absorbs it all into himself. He takes it into himself, and he absorbs. He absorbs the sin. He absorbs the pride. He absorbs the oppression. He also absorbs the hurt and the brokenness and the rejection and the loss. He takes it all in upon himself, and he pays for all of it. Now, this is why when you get into the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament will talk over and over again about the Spirit. The Spirit is the presence of God. And the writers in the New Testament will talk about how the Spirit comes to live inside of us. This is what you have to understand. This is why the concept of the Spirit is so important to the New Testament writers. It's why it's such an important part of Christianity. Because the Spirit is about connection. It's about intimacy. That Paul, who's a guy who writes a big chunk of the New Testament, Paul actually defines his core identity as being in Christ. You and I, we define our identity in our world with all kinds of things, but Paul says, no, my fundamental identity is I am in Christ. That when I place my life into Christ, his presence comes and lives within me. And again, to some of us, that may what does that really sound like? Is that like Casper the Friendly Ghost that lives inside of me? But here's what you have to get. Faith is ultimately about this intimate connection and sharing between us and Jesus that happens through his Spirit. But that sharing works completely to our advantage. Because what happens is through that Spirit, through that presence that is alive within us, we share with Jesus all of our hurt, all of our sin, all of our pride, all of our arrogance, all of our pain, all of our brokenness, all of our rejection. And he shares with us all of his grace and all of his mercy and all of his love and all of his life. See, Christianity and faith ultimately isn't about like a set of doctrines. It's about this intimate sharing with Jesus through the power of his Spirit. And all of it works to our advantage. See, Paul says, Peter at this point says, this is what Jesus did. In the midst of all of this craziness, in the midst of all of this hurt and pain and sin and all this injustice, what he does is he absorbs it into himself. And then he gives us a brand new way forward. But you have to understand that in the first century world, the idea of the cross is crazy. Here's what Paul writes in a letter that he writes to the church in Corinth. Here's what Paul says about the cross. He says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. See, Paul just owns it up right here. Paul says, listen, I get it. The whole idea of the cross is nuts because think of what you know. And you may know a lot, you may know little, but think about what you know about like ancient Greek mythology. Like all their gods and goddesses, like Zeus and Hera and Hades and Poseidon, okay, all those. It's all about power. That ancient Greek mythology, you have these gods and goddesses, they're living on Mount Olympus, and they're strong and they're powerful. That's how people in the first century world, that's how they pictured gods. That's how they pictured goddesses. So the picture, what Paul's trying to say here, and even what Peter's talking about, the fact that God comes down to earth in flesh and blood and is dying on a cross, that's utter foolishness. When you compare that next to, Zeus reigning on Mount Olympus with his thunder waiting to throw it down, it's just foolishness. Like why would a God do that? And Paul says what you're missing is the cross is actually power. Which again is crazy because the cross was really about weakness. The cross was designed to break you. The cross was an instrument of Roman shame and torture that they reserved for the worst criminals. The whole point of the cross is I'm going to put you up there in public for everyone to see, and I'm going to break you, and everyone's going to watch you break. Paul says that's why it's foolishness. That's why people who look at it go, why would you follow this guy? He got crucified. They broke him. It's foolishness. Paul says, yeah, but you're missing power behind it. Paul goes on a few verses later. And he says this. He says, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So Paul says, look, I get it. I get it. That really and Paul points out both sides, Jews and Greeks. You got both sides. Paul says it's foolishness and it's a stumbling block. Paul says, I get that because you're coming at this from different perspectives. I get that. Paul says, but what you're missing is that at the heart of the cross, there is power and there is wisdom. Because Jesus does something on the cross that there's no other way to do. See, when we talk about living the good life, when we talk about embracing the good life, we may have different ideas in our personal life, like what does a good life look for you, what does a good life look for me? But on like a society level, on a national level, on a cultural level, what I hear over and over again are really prominently two ideas. These are the two pillars that we look at to say, you know what, if we could live in a world, if we could live in a nation, if we could live in a culture that functions on these two pillars, this would be the good life. And here they are. It's justice and love. Those are the two ideas that I hear people talk about. This is what we want to govern our society. If we lived in a society that was governed by these two things, then everything would be great. We want there to be justice, we want there to be love. We want things to be done right, and we want there to be the spirit of love. And this is what, again, over and over again, I hear people advocating for. This is even the cries you hear from the streets right now of protesters, is people, this is what we want. We want our culture, we want our society to function on these kind of dual pillars of justice and love. Here's the problem. These things are polar opposite. There's tension between these things. Because justice is about doing what's right. Justice is about doing what's fair. Love is about grace and forgiveness and mercy. And there's a tension between those things. And this is the tension that you and I feel in every conflict in our life. You pick the conflict. It could be personal conflict, family conflict, conflict at work. It could be social conflict, whatever. There's always this tension of, should I do the right thing or the loving thing? Should I do the just thing or should I do the graceful thing? This is why we always kind of have this, how should I respond in the midst of these moments? Because a lot of times when we think, well, I need to do what's right doesn't always seem loving. And at the same time, what's loving doesn't always seem right. And so the reason that we have such conflict, the reason that we can never figure out what to do is because we try, I want us to be this foundation of justice and love, but we can't do it. Because they're like these polar opposite ideas. But this is why Paul describes the cross as power and wisdom. Because on the cross, Jesus does something that there is no other way to do. None. That the cross is the only way to hold love and justice together. Because the cross isn't just justice and it isn't just love, it's both. And it's both equally at the same time. John, in his account of the life of Jesus, when he describes Jesus, he says Jesus is the fullness of grace and of truth, of justice and of love. Because what you see on the cross is you see justice. You see how hard and how difficult justice is. But you also see love. And it's not one at the expense of the other. It's not trading it off. It's both. That on the cross, Jesus does what throughout human history we have never been able to do. He holds love and justice together equally. And in doing that, he makes this brand new way forward. Jesus says there's a way forward. And it may seem backwards, it may seem opposite, it may seem totally different, it may defy logic and reason. But what it does is it does everything that we've ever wanted to do. It does everything that we've been struggling and trying to do. It brings together these two ideas that are polar opposite and have so much tension. This is why when the writers of the New Testament talked about the death of Jesus, and not just the death, but his resurrection, because Jesus doesn't stay dead. He actually resurrects, and his resurrection is proof that on the other side of death, on the other side of this new way that he's making, there is the good life. That when the writers of the New Testament talk about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, there's a word they use to describe it, and the word is gospel. Gospel literally means good news. It's the same word that Jesus uses when he walks into his home synagogue in Capernaum and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news." Gospel. The gospel is the power of God to give all of us the good life. The gospel is this power to make a new way forward in the midst of pain and in the midst of hurt and in the midst of pride and sin and oppression and selfishness. It's this new way. It's this way that's about bringing everyone together in justice and in love. I love what Paul writes to the church in Rome. Romans 1:16, he says this. This is a great verse. He says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to Jew, then to Gentiles." And Paul says, see, that the gospel is this new way forward that really, at its heart, is bringing everyone together. Paul in other places will say, because of the gospel, there's neither a Jew nor Gentile, or that the gospel is about bringing us all together in this brand new way forward. It's about erasing all of this division. It's about bringing people together in justice and in love. Not one or the other, but both, and creating this brand new way forward. This is why the writers in the New Testament talk about it as good news, as gospel. That the gospel is God's means for making a way for all of us to experience the good life. That the gospel literally changes everything for everyone. This is what we're going to unpack over the next several weeks throughout this month as we go through this series of Good Life. We're going to talk about how does the gospel transform us? What does it mean to actually live the gospel? What does it mean to let the power of the gospel transform us from the inside out? What does it mean to follow this new path? Because what Jesus says, he said, listen, if you want to share in the new way that I'm creating, you first have to share in the death. It's not just about sharing in the life, you share in the death too. And when we share in that, it creates this new way forward, and it creates this good life for all of us. And we're going to talk about, what does that look like? How do we orient our lives around the gospel? How do we center our lives around the gospel so that it changes everything and transforms us and allows us as individuals, as church, as a community, to make this new way forward that brings us all together? But before we begin, I need to make one thing really clear, because I don't ever want anyone to accuse me of being a liar. The gospel challenges and confronts all of us. That I do believe that the gospel is the way forward. I believe the gospel is the only way forward. I believe the gospel is the way forward that brings us all together. I believe that the gospel is what leads to the good life for all of us. But that doesn't mean you're going to like what it asks you to do. Because the gospel challenges and confronts all of us. There are certain things inside of each one of us that the gospel will celebrate. There are other things inside each one of us that the gospel will condemn. And so it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. The cross was not easy. It doesn't mean you're going to like what the gospel asks you to do. It doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable. But I can promise you that on the other side of it, there will be the good life. That there is a death. But the gospel also says that after that death, there is a resurrection. That the good news of Jesus is that all of us can live the good life through the power of the gospel.
Praise
thank you so much for joining us, hanging out with us, inviting us into your home this weekend. Before we're done, I just want to let you know of two things really quick, two important things. One is this Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, we're having a worship night. And we're going to stream it. It'll be, so log onto our website or through social media. You can watch it and interact with it. It's going to be a night of worship and prayer. So please plan on doing that. It's going to be powerful. Another thing I want to let you know is we started a new thing about a month ago called Growth Track. And Growth Track is something that we're doing online. It's a way to engage online. And really, Growth Track is designed to be this place where we can explore where faith and life intersect. And talk about, hey, how does faith impact our life? And so we do Growth Track kind of in these different modules or sessions. And we're going to launch a new Growth Track module on June 15th, and it's called Listening. During the midst of all of this kind of racial tension that's happening within our culture, within our country, and you've seen stories of protesters, and you've seen stories of these brutal killings, I know there's a lot of people that are wondering, like, what do we do? And I've really been trying to think and pray about, hey, as a pastor, as a person, as a church, how should we respond? And what I have been convicted of is that really where we need to begin, where I need to begin, where we need to begin as a church is just by listening. That the reality is that I'm a white pastor, and we're a predominantly white church and a predominantly white community. Now, there is some diversity in our community, there's some diversity in our church, but the reality is we are predominantly white. And so I'm convinced that where we need to begin is just by listening, by trying to gain some amount of empathy so that we can talk about, hey, how do we really move forward to help make changes that last? If anybody wants to go out and protest, if anybody wants to put things on social media, I'm not telling you to not do that. But what I'm saying is, as an individual, as a pastor, as a church, I'm convinced this is where we need to start, is just by listening. And so that's what this next round of Growth Track is going to be about. It's not going to be a debate. It's literally going to be a chance for us to listen. I've reached out to a young black minister, pastor that I really respect and admire. And we're going to sit down and have a conversation. But more than a conversation, it's really going to be just kind of about him talking. Because I've told him, I said, listen, I don't know. There's things about this that I don't understand. There's things about this that in some ways I probably can never understand. But to the best that I can, I want to try to listen and I want to try to empathize. And so that's what this round of Growth Track is going to be about. It's going to be about listening. And along with that, there will be some content to watch each week, but there's also going to be some other resources, some Bible verses, some Bible passages, some prayer exercises, maybe some other readings, just to spend these next 4 weeks. It's going to be a 4-week session of Growth Track, just listening. Listening to the cries of hurt and pain, and also listening to what it is that God is saying to us. What is it in us that God is trying to break down and build up during this season? And so I really encourage you, go to fcchb.com and register for Growth Track. It's totally free. It's totally free. It's just your name and email address, but register for this round of Growth Track. I promise you it will be beneficial. It will be worth it. I think it's something that as a church, as a nation, as a community, we desperately need. Again, thank you so much for joining us, for hanging out with us. I miss y'all. I love y'all. I'm praying for y'all. Have a great day. God bless you.
I do my best to find some kind of glow. I'm giving it some heart and soul now. From the darkest grays, the sunburst, clouds break. Yeah, we see that fire from the streets of Babylon to the road that we've been on now. The kaleidoscope clings another. Seen my worst, and yet you see some hope in me. Black and white set us free like the queen to the rook. Your decision was a sure thing, honey, yeah, a sure thing. No wonder I feel like I'm missing the heavy load. But no matter what daylight brings to us, we all know. This is life in color. Today feels like no other. In the darkest grace, the sunburst clouds break. This is life in motion. And just when I could run, this breaks in one. Sunburst clouds break. This is life in color. This is life in color. This is life in color. Today feels like no other. In the darkest grays, the sunburst clouds break. This is life in motion. And just when I could run this race anymore, the sunburst clouds break. This is life in color. This is life in color. take you